Time. It's my computer clock says 12:01, so perhaps we should get started. I want to welcome everybody to this new format for the Born Symposium. This is the 28th annual symposium because it would have, if it had been last spring when we were originally scheduled, that's what it would have been, number 28. Coincidentally, that's exactly how many years I've been here. I arrived with the first iteration. It was an EPSCoR meeting back then and a much smaller group. The Institute has grown in marvelous ways over the years. It's become even more interdisciplinary, which is fascinating. And the Born Symposium is our opportunity to find out what everybody's doing in the Institute, in particular our students, who come from all different disciplines and combinations of disciplines, all in some way approaching issues of climate. And this is how we inform ourselves about what's going on and learn about opportunities to collaborate with each other that we might not otherwise know about. So this is a new format, as I was talking about with Dan Churchill just a minute ago, and some of you heard. We live in a Zoom world now because of COVID, and it's not entirely bad. Instead of meeting for 2 intensive days in the spring, which we hope we'll get back to in the future, we will be meeting once a week on Mondays from noon to 1 in this environment. For the fall, each session will have 3 talks by students. Each talk will be, I think, a maximum of 12 minutes with a couple of minutes for questions and answers. Starting next week, well, actually not next week, I remind you that there is no session next week because it is Indigenous Peoples Day, but in 2 weeks with the next session, we'll have a panel of graduate students who will comment on the previous papers and, if possible, look for links between them. I tried to kind of combine papers that might have some links and yet be from different disciplines. So we'll see how that goes. We will also have a graduate student moderator for each of the sessions, beginning today with Frankie Sanamond, to I will, excuse me, I will pass this over in just a minute. But that's the layout. And we hope that you find this worthwhile and enjoyable and a great learning experience, and that you build your interdisciplinary connections through participation. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Frankie, and it's your show. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Really nice to see your faces. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Frankie Saint-Amand, and I'm an interdisciplinary PhD student. I'll be introducing our student speakers today, Heather, Inga, and Meghan. And we will start off with a talk from Heather Clifford. So what I've asked these 3 speakers to do is, since we don't have our beloved clam up sign with us, is to set timers on their cell phones or some sort of stopwatch for 12 minutes. And they're going to start it after I introduce them. So hopefully we'll keep on time and have some time after each talk for a couple of questions. So like I said, we'll start off with Heather Clifford. She's going to be talking about natural and human contributions to pre-monsoon snow and stream chemistry from the Khumbu region, Nepal. Thank you, Heather.
All right, let me get this sharing my screen. Let's see. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Great. All right, I'll get started. So my name is Heather Clifford, and today I will be talking about natural and human contributions to pre-monsoon snow and stream chemistry from the Khumbu region in Nepal. Our study, give me one second. Our study on the Khumbu, study focuses on the Khumbu region, which has been found to be at risk environmentally. In addition to a changing climate, in the high mountain regions, the local population in the Khumbu is around 10,000, while the number of trekkers and climbers visiting annually to Everest Base Camp and Mount Everest can reach up to 60,000. So this poses a question: does the increased human footprint have negative impact on the local environment? In addition, the Khumbu Glacier is responsible for around 65% of the local water supply. And this poses another question: is the water quality at risk from local or distant pollution sources, considering Asia is the most significant global contributor of anthropogenic trace metals to the atmosphere? So in order to help answer these questions and more about the changing climate, several researchers from CCI were part of the National Geographic and Rolex's Perpetual Planet Everest expedition. During April and May 2019, a multidisciplinary team of more than 30 scientists conducted fieldwork high on Mount Everest, as well as across the Khumbu Valley and the surrounding regions. The overall goal of the expedition was to improve our understanding and resilience to the impacts of climate change in the Mount Everest region through comprehensive studies of climate, past, present, and future. So the teams on this expedition included a glaciology team, a geology team, biology, mapping, and meteorology. So as a part of the glaciology team, including myself, Mario Pataki, and Paul Mayuski from CCI, our research was focusing on assessing the anthropogenic influences on the Khumbu region by taking environmental chemistry measurements of different sources. So these different sources include snow chemistry, which can be used to understand source and emission strengths and help track aerosol transport and deposition. Another source is water chemistry, which can be used to assess water quality and determine source strengths. And lastly, ice core chemistry, which can give us a sense of past climate and atmospheric conditions and assess natural variability with modern conditions. So for the methodology of this project, we collected around 94 snow samples from these 3 different locations. So we have Everest Base Camp, above Everest Base Camp at between Camps 1 and Camp 2 along the summit route to Mount Everest. And we also have samples from Mount Labuche, which is just south of these locations. We also collected around 18 stream water samples. So we collected samples from the Khumbu Glacier Melt, which is around Everest Base Camp, the lower Khumbu region, which is circled of Douglas and the Fariche samples. And then we also have Imja Valley, which is sourced from the Imja Glacier, which is close to the Imja Lake and just north of Dingboche. And we also collected a 3.5 meter ice core, which was drilled from the Khumbu Glacier directly below the Khumbu Icefall, which is also located at Everest Base Camp. And so I want to note that this is a preliminary study that we conducted and that we only were able to take samples during the pre-monsoon season, April, May. So this is the dry season in the Khumbu region. And so there's not that much precipitation coming through. But we were able to take this many amount of samples during those 2 months. So for this methodology, we measured around 47 major and trace element concentrations for this talk. I narrowed it down to a few so that it wouldn't get too overwhelming. And these are measured using an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer system at CCI. We looked at major ions using ion chromatography at CCI. We looked at stable water isotopes using a Picaro 3 measured at CCI as well. And we also looked at black carbon concentrations just in the snow. Those were measured at the University of Washington using a single particle soot photometer. And so the analyses we performed on this data, we did some statistical overviews of the chemistry based on the sample type. We also did a principal component analyses on the different sample types as well. PCA is a statistical procedure used to find patterns and correlations in the large data. I'll be discussing these as percent variances and the corresponding principal components, and also looking at the enrichment factor calculations. This is a calculation using Kruskal ratio of elements to determine if there are additional sources which are most likely anthropogenic. And also we did additional studies on these snow and stream samples to look at anthropogenic influences that I will not be discussing today, but we looked at PFAS, which is a man-made chemical, microplastics, and the changes in albedo from black carbon. And so going into some of the interpretations from this big data set, we found that the Khumbu Glacier ice core reflects pre-modern concentrations. We found this because we did radiocarbon dates, and it shows that the dating is pre-modern, so before 1950. Concentrations are lower than stream and snow samples. So as you can see in this figure here, the gray is from the Khumbu Glacier ice core, and the blue and red are snow and stream respectively. And also the PCA results that we got from the Khumbu ice core suggest only crustal and marine sources and no significant patterns from anthropogenically sourced elements. We also found from the snow samples that pre-monsoon aerosol deposition is dominated by dust. And so we found that through principal component analysis in the snow and also the ice. The first PC is dominated by crustal elements. And also based on previous studies, we know that this dust is likely originating from Western sources, such as Southern and Central Asia and the Tibetan Plateau. So this figure here is showing that the highest concentrations within the snow samples are from the crustal elements. And so less commonly, pre-monsoon transport of southerly air masses occur. So monsoon aerosol transport is typically dominated by southerly air masses, but during the pre-monsoon season, it's less common. And so we found that the marine elements, Na and Cl, dominate the principal component analysis, PC2 in snow and PC3 in ice. We also were able to measure a cyclone snow event, which is the largest snow event that occurred at base camp from May 3rd to May 4th. And this figure here is showing a back trajectory of this cyclone, showing the southerly Bay of Bengal source, which shows high sodium and also low crustal concentrations as well. And so for the stream samples, we're able to find influences of rock weathering, surface runoff, and glacier melt. So silicate and carbonate and or sulfate weathering are dominant influences within the Khumbu and Imja Valley stream samples based on the PC results. And the Khumbu Glacier melt stream has stronger influence of snow and ice melt, and we found that from lower concentrations and similar delta O18 values to the Khumbu Glacier ice core. So here you can see the Khumbu Glacier melt in orange compared to the Khumbu Valley and the Imja Valley data. And so now moving forward into the human contributions from the data. So we found anthropogenic influences within the snow and stream chemistry. So enriched values, which is greater than 10 enrichment factor calculation values of lead, bismuth, arsenic, and uranium was found in the snow and the streams, among other elements, but I'm not discussing during this talk. And so these elements also dominate the principal component analysis 3 in snow and streams. So we found these anthropogenic elements dominating a pattern within the snow and streams, and the enriched values, which we can see here with the red line showing a value of 10. So some of these sample groups are above, some are below, such as the cyclone Fanny is below, and the arsenic, uranium, and lead, showing that these are most likely background and from fresher snow and some of the southerly source. And so we also were able to detect potential locally sourced anthropogenic aerosols. And so we found that through significant levels of bismuth, lead, black carbon within the snow samples. And these are likely linked to local emissions from biomass burning and fossil fuel engines in the area. And so here we see lead, uranium, bismuth, and arsenic in the black carbon. And so as you can see in the black carbon, the Labuche samples are significantly higher along with the base camp, also for the lead and the bismuth as well. And so we also found concerning levels of lead within the stream samples. So high concentrations of above 20 micrograms per liter were found at the Fariche site. And this is more than double the WHO safety level of 10 micrograms per liter, which is shown with the blue line. The red signifies the Fariche samples. And here on this map, you can see this red dot that's circled. That's the Fariche site, and it's downstream from the Douglas site, which you can see in green, which is significantly lower at 4 micrograms per liter. So we suggest that there's potential for contamination caused by unknown human activity upstream from the Fariche sampling site, or a secondary source of water flow not related to the Khumbu Glacier melt. However, future research is necessary to determine a source. And so based on this, we can say that while this glacial streams can seem safe, local pollution from tourism could create major health issues. And so in conclusion, for natural resources, or sorry, natural influences, pre-monsoon aerosol transport is dominated by dust, most likely from a western source, and less commonly suddenly air masses. The Khumbu and Imja Valley streams are strongly influenced by weathering, while the Khumbu Glacier melt is strongly influenced by snow and ice melt. For anthropogenic influences, increased tourism and land usage could be contributed to the high values of anthropogenically sourced chemistry, such as the bismuth, lead, black carbon in the snow collected from Mount Liguchi and Everest Base Camp, and also concerning concentrations of lead in stream samples. So for future research, rising tourism in the Khumbu Valley will likely contribute to increased pollutant loading. And this preliminary study reveals the need for more spatially extensive monitoring over long time periods to determine human impacts on the water system, in addition to adaptation and mitigation planning. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge a few of my co-authors for this manuscript that's currently in review, as in addition to the following institutes. And I will take any questions.
If I've got a question for you, Heather, I'll jump in. I think it's really incredible that you can identify these individual events in your study area. Do you see any potential long-term benefits for environmental research in this area with this capacity to identify extreme events?
Definitely. I mean, I think the tourism, I mean, hopefully tourism will be curbed a little bit. I mean, in Nepal, it's, you know, so many people go up all the time, and they haven't really curbed how many people can climb Mount Everest or how many tourists are coming in. They've started to implement more environmentally friendly, I guess, routines of people bringing trash down, etc. But I think that there needs to be a lot more monitoring that goes down in this area. I don't think I haven't come across many studies that looked at this prior, especially through the government as well.
Any questions? Any other questions for Heather? Great, thank you so much, Heather. We will move on to Inga's speech. She's going to be talking about natural and human contributions to pre-monsoon snow. Oh, I'm sorry, we just heard that. Inga's going to be talking about causes of a cold bias in modest land surface temperature in the St. Elias Range. And this is Ingalise, Kindstedt. Thanks, Inga.
Thanks, Frankie. All right, hold on one second while I get this shared.
Take your time.
All right, can you see my slides? Awesome.
I can, yeah.
Great. Okay, so like Frankie said, my name is Inga, and I'm going to be discussing causes of a cold bias in modest land surface temperatures in the St. Elias. So for those of you who don't know, MODIS stands for Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer. It's an instrument, it's housed on a couple of different NASA satellites. This is an image of one of them called Terra. It's also housed on another called Aqua. But MODIS products are used for a whole variety of applications. They're used to look at things ranging from land cover and land use changes to clouds, aerosols, ocean color, phytoplankton. And what we're really interested in is looking at surface temperatures. And in particular, we want to know about surface temperatures in the St. Elias Range, which is kind of here on the border of Alaska and the Yukon. I've got our study sites pictured in the inset at Eclipse and Divide. And the reason that we want to know about surface temperatures in this region is that, as you can see from the imagery here in the map, there's a lot of ice there. And this ice is locked up in small alpine glaciers that are really sensitive to temperature changes. So this is a figure from a paper that came out last year looking at cumulative ice mass changes regionally around the globe. And what they did is they looked at each specific region, and pictured here Indicated by the size of the bubble is the cumulative mass change since 1961. So how much ice are we losing? And the color of the bubble indicates how fast that's occurring. And if you look at Alaska, you can see that while Alaska has the largest bubble of any particular region, so it's lost the most ice, and it's been doing so at some of the highest rates. Now what that means is that this region in Alaska and the Yukon has both contributed really notably to sea level rise up until now, and it's actually predicted to continue to do so. That's why we're interested in what's going on with the glaciers in this region. And if we want to know how they're responding to temperature changes, we need to know something about the temperature. A challenge in this is that the St. Elias, as well as other mountain ranges in this region, it's really, really rugged and difficult to access for in situ temperatures. So we depend on remote sensing data sets like the MODIS land surface temperature data to give us an idea of what's going on. Unfortunately, MODIS LSTs have been observed to be colder than the limited in situ temperatures than we have. So kind of the goal of this project here is to identify why that is so that we can correct for it. We have a couple of hypotheses about what's going on here. The first is that this cold bias in the MODIS LSTs is due to the large spatial footprint of the sensor in really heterogeneous alpine terrain. And the second is that the cold bias is due to poorly constrained snow emissivity values. So if you're up in the St. Elias, it's not like being out on the interior of a large ice sheet. It's not basically flat and white. I mean, you're in a mountain range. So I've included my photo from my cover slide again, and you can see in this, as well as in panel A, all of these ridges and nunataks that are sticking up out of the ice. Now what that means is that we don't just have snow and ice here, we have rock too. We have variation in surface type, as well as variation in a number of other things, like elevation, and incline, aspect, which are affecting shading and wind scouring and deposition, and all of these are affecting surface temperature. So maybe what's happening is that within MODIS's footprint, which is a square kilometer, and then if you look in panels B and C, those are zooming in on the study sites at Eclipse and Divide. And the orange boxes are the MODIS footprint overlaid on the imagery there. And some of these changes in surface type, elevation, et cetera, are occurring within that square kilometer. So maybe just averaging what's going on over that whole kilometer isn't really giving us an accurate picture of what's happening with surface temperature, and that's why we're getting this cold bias. So to test for that, what we did was that we compared surface temperatures derived from MODIS to those derived from ASTER, which is another instrument also housed on the same satellite. ASTER's footprint is much smaller. It's 90 meters as opposed to the kilometer of MODIS. And the ASTER footprint is pictured in green here. We also plan to incorporate Landsat data, but the Landsat surface temperatures haven't come out yet. They're scheduled to late this year, so hopefully we'll be able to incorporate those as well. Our other hypothesis is that, well, maybe this cold bias is due to poorly constrained snow emissivity values. Emissivity tells us how effective a surface is at emitting thermal radiation, so how good of an emitter is it? Basically, it's the ratio of energy emitted from your surface to the energy that would be emitted by the perfect black body emitter under the same conditions. So same wavelength of energy, same temperature, same viewing conditions. And emissivity can vary a lot, even among surfaces that might seem consistent, like snow. So this is from a study that was done back in 2006 that's looking at emissivity over different snow types. And I've boxed the wavelengths that are pertinent to our MODIS land surface temperature calculations, about 10.5 to 12.5 microns. And what you can see is that especially as you get up into the 12.5 micron range, I mean, you can have pretty big emissivity differences depending on whether your snow is fine grained, coarse grained, or somewhere in between. And so maybe what's going on is that when these MODIS land surface temperatures are calculated and an emissivity value is used to do that, if the emissivity value isn't really matching what the snow conditions are, then maybe that's giving us this cold bias. So to see if the algorithm that's using these emissivity values is introducing the cold bias we see, we looked at the final MODIS land surface temperature product relative to in situ temperatures. And we also looked at kind of the preliminary temperature product, brightness temperature, before that emissivity is applied. We looked to see if there are similar patterns in how those compare to the in situ measurements that we have. So before I jump into some of our preliminary results, I want to give a quick overview of all of the data sets that we're using here. Now, some of these are future plans. So the ice cores in particular, eventually we want to tie this back to ice cores that are in the region. We have a core at Eclipse, which is one of our study sites right in the St. Elias. We also have a core at Mount Hunter, which is not exactly in the St. Elias, but in the larger Alaska region. But those aren't immediately relevant right here. I also mentioned that we want to incorporate Landsat data, but like I said, that hasn't come out yet. So again, not immediately relevant here, which leaves us with our MODIS data, our ASTRO data, and our in situ data. In situ data coming from a few different sources. We've got weather stations at Divide and at Eclipse, and also a couple years of temperature data from an iButton temperature sensor at Eclipse. And so here we have some of our results. Panel A is looking at that MODIS land surface temperature. The product is called MYD21, that's the label there on the Y, minus in situ temperature. So this is a temperature difference. And if we're seeing a negative temperature difference here, that's indicating the MODIS temperatures are lower than what we're getting in situ. And completely consistently with prior observations, we see that the MODIS temperatures are indeed lower than in situ, particularly in the fall and the winter. So I've got them here binned by season. Panel B is ASTRO temperatures. Unfortunately, ASTRO data is really limited, and so we just didn't have enough data to bin by season and still have a robust data set for each season. So this is just all the ASTRO temperatures binned together. But similarly to the MODIS, we do see that ASTRO temperatures are typically lower than those that are being measured in situ. So it seems that just improving the spatial resolution of our sensor isn't getting rid of this cold bias. And then panel C is looking at the MODIS brightness temperatures. So again, that's before the algorithm that uses the emissivity value is applied to convert them into the final land surface temperatures. And here, the value of the temperature difference isn't really what's important. What we're looking at is patterns. So in our final land surface temperatures, what we saw was that we had that greater discrepancy between the MODIS and the in situ in the fall and the winter. And so we're saying, is that also the case with the brightness temperatures here? And it appears that it is. There's a lot of variety, a lot of variability in this data, but in general, yeah, we have larger discrepancies in the fall and the winter. So it also appears that that algorithm that's using the emissivity values isn't introducing whatever is going on here, this discrepancy between MODIS and in situ. Now, because we had this really great weather station data from Divide, we also compared some of our temperature differences to a few meteorological variables. So here again, we have our MODIS land surface temperature minus in situ on the Y. On the X, we've got wind speed, and then the color bar indicates the level of incoming solar radiation. I have a horizontal line just at 0, so that's indicating no bias at all. But what we see is that our largest temperature differences tend to be at low wind speeds and at low levels of incoming solar radiation. Interestingly, that's consistent with some work that was done over Summit, Greenland a few years ago. So I apologize for the inconsistency here in the y-axis that just flipped vertically from one another. Our temperature differences happen to be recorded as MODIS, which is measuring the surface temperature, snow surface temperature, minus in situ, which is actually measuring air temperature above the surface, whereas Adolf et al.'s temperature differences are recorded as air minus surface. So it's the same information, just oriented differently. But the results are the same in that their largest temperature differences are also typically associated with lower wind speeds and lower levels of incoming solar radiation. Now, what's really important here is that with Adolf et al.'s temperatures, both of their temperatures, their surface temperature and their air temperature, are being measured in situ. They're not using remote sensing data here. So these discrepancies that they're getting are actually physical temperature differences. They're not an artifact of the instrumentation or the algorithms that are used in these MODIS calculations that we have. So they've got something physical going on, and that begs the question, well, is something similar happening in the St. Elias? We just don't really know right now. That's one of the big questions that we would like to answer going forward. I actually have it listed as my second bullet point here. Is there something physical going on? Is there physical temperature difference between the surface and the air? We don't have paired in situ surface and air temperature measurements like they do at Summit, but that would be a question that would be great to answer, to know whether these routinely biased MODIS temperatures are an issue with MODIS, or if they're actually reflecting something physical going on. And then our other major area that for improvement would be our understanding of emissivity. We just don't have a good grasp of what's going on with emissivity. even though it looks like the emissivity isn't completely introducing this cold bias that we see, we can't eliminate it as an exacerbating factor. And emissivity can change both over time and space with the snow surface. So over time, for example, after a snowfall event, you have compaction processes going on that are changing the surface of the snow, and that's going to impact the emissivity. We don't know how quickly those processes are going on and how quickly that affects emissivity and to what degree. And similarly, we don't know to what degree emissivity is changing on a spatial scale. So is it changing really drastically over meters, tens of meters, centimeters? We don't really know. So we do have a few of these big unanswered questions moving forward, but for now, I'll leave it at that and take questions from you guys if you have any.
It looks like we have a question from Mariana. I can't tell if you're raising your hand or maybe that's an applaud emoji.
I have a quick question.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. Very nice presentation and very important work. Were you able to get any, you have a great weather station there that's obviously giving you a tremendous amount of information. Were you able to get any spatial information relative to some of these properties while you were up there, perhaps traveling around a bit to collect an understanding of how the angle that the snow is facing, shade, topographic impacts, etc.?
Right, so I was not able to go up and collect. That was the hope, to go get spatial information this past summer. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to happen because of COVID. But yeah, that's exactly kind of the line of thinking that we had.
Okay, makes sense. Good, thank you.
Any other questions for Inga? Great, well, thanks so much, Inga.
Thank you, Frankie.
All right, we will move on to our last talk of the day. We have Tracking the Southern Hemisphere Westerlies Through Paleoclimatic Reconstruction of the Falkland Islands, Meghan Spoth.
There we are. Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. Come over here. Present. Okay, I think we're all looking at the same thing now. So my work is on the variations of the Southern Hemisphere the Southern Hemisphere Westerlies, and I'm looking over the last 23,000 years using lake records from the Falkland Islands. The Southern Hemisphere Westerlies, or the Westerlies that I'll call them throughout the talk, are thought to cause abrupt climate change in both the Southern Hemisphere and for global climate. The position and intensity of the Westerlies can control the climate of the southern mid-latitudes, in addition to the upwelling and carbon sequestration power of the Southern Ocean. For these reasons, the International Panel on Climate Change has focused on this region as important for future climate change. Climate modelers have looked to model this complex system, and since it's very complex, a lot of the future projections from these models are contradictory or difficult to interpret. Looking at the paleoproxies instead, these records are very limited, as there are few terrestrial records that we can extract in the southern mid-latitudes. Unfortunately, the interpretations from those records are also contradictory. So we don't have a lot we're working with when we're trying to understand what the Westerlies have done in the past and what they're doing in the future. The animation that we're looking at here is from the Climate Reanalyzer. We can see that the Westerlies have a northern position during the austral winters, and they have a more southern poleward position during the austral summers. The Westerlies are focused at about 50 degrees south latitude. As we can see here, there's increased wind intensity and western prevailing winds at this section, and there's also increased precipitation within the wind belt. Previous studies has indicated that the glacial periods may have had a more northern equatorward position of the Westerlies, while interglacials like today have this poleward location closer to the equator. So my research is looking to answer and shed light on some of these big questions about what the westerlies have been doing since the last glacial maximum. For my research, I focused on the Falkland Islands. They're at 51 degrees south latitude, putting them within the modern wind belt of the westerlies, and they're about 500 kilometers off the east coast of South America. My field site is blocked here in red, and I'm going to be looking at Mount Osborne. Looking at Mount Osborne has a series of cirques that have been carved into its summit through alpine glaciers. Alpine glaciers occupied these cirques during the last ice age. I'll be focusing on Tarn 2 here at 600 meters above sea level, and also the inner basin of Tarn 4 at 520 meters above sea level. So for the field site, all of our supplies were shipped to Stanley, East Falkland, and Mount Osborne is remote even for the Falkland Islands, so all of our supplies were taken by jeep over the mountainside, over the boggy landscape. Once we were there, this picture here is Tom Lowell and Brenda Hall using a Zodiac to core one of the tarns. And pictured down below here is my tent from camping out there, and we have some of the famous stone runs of the Falklands behind, and this is one of the valleys next to Mount Osborne. Back at the University of Maine, I was able to conduct stratigraphic analysis of the cores. So looking here, there's changes in both sediment type and color down core of Tarn 2, and this shows that there has been variations throughout time. There's also these notable whiter bands, which are tephra vents blown in from the west from Patagonia. Also at the University of Maine, I did loss of ignition to determine the organic content of my cores. I also traveled to the LACOR facility in Minnesota to get high resolution magnetic susceptibility and to take high resolution images like this one here. I then traveled to the University of Cincinnati, where I was able to extract the leaf wax from bulk sediment cores. I did that using accelerated solvent extract shown here, and then also columns as shown above. I then use a mass spectrometer to get the isotopic compositions of the carbon and hydrogen of the N-alkanes. Back at the University of Maine, with the help of the Beast Lab, I was able to extract pollen from bulk sediment samples. I then looked at the samples under a microscope where I ID'd and counted the pollen grains. Shown here is Poaceae. This is of the family of grasses, and this is Astelia pumila. These are both native and local to the cirques today, and they're of typically dry-ish soil compared to wet, saturated soil. Pictured down below here is Nothophagus. It is a genus of beech tree found in Patagonia. Since the Falkland Islands has no trees on it, all tree pollen that I found were aeolian deposition from Patagonia, and is tracking the wind intensity coming to the Falkland Islands. Taking a look at the data, plotted here is my magnetic susceptibility of Tarn 2 and Tarn 4 against age, which is in thousands of years using radiocarbon dates. My Tarn 2 data is plotted in green, and Tarn 4 is plotted in gold. Tarn 2 extends to about 13,000 years ago, while Tarn 4 extends to 23,000 years ago. The magnetic susceptibility data that I'm looking at here is thought to track wind intensity, with higher magnetic susceptibility showing increased wind intensity. This is because most of the deposition into my tiny basin is thought to be from wind-driven sources. There's also a signal in here of potentially a distal and close dust source that I'm still determining, but that's thought to be most of the variation down core. Overall, my data is showing that there is increased magnetic susceptibility from 11,000 years to 23,000 years, suggesting higher wind intensity, and there's another peak at 5.5 thousand years ago. Moving on to the biomarker data for my leaf wax data. All this data is in conjunction to a modern calibration done at the University of Cincinnati. Meghan determined that the mid-chain N-alkanes were derived from aquatic plants, and the aquatic plant delta deuterium values reflect that of the lake water. The long-chain N-alkanes were derived from terrestrial plants, and the terrestrial plant's delta deuterium values reflect that of the local precipitation reaching the cirques. And the difference between the two delta deuterium records is the evaporation rate for the basins. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on this precipitation data. This gray bar plotted here is the delta deuterium record from the modern sediment, which is thought to be a biofractionation offset from the precipitation reaching the Falklands today. All data points that fall to the right of this gray bar are enriched in deuterium compared to the modern precipitation coming to the island, and all data points to the left of the gray bar are more depleted in deuterium than the precipitation reaching the Falklands today. We're going to be coming back to this graph as part of my discussion. And finally, this is my preliminary pollen record. I have more samples that are still being counted and processed. This is the accumulation rate of the pollen plotted by age. I had 3 major proxies that I was able to get from my pollen. I have exotics, which are wind-blown pollen, thought to be tracking the wind intensity. And then I have pollen that preferred dry or well-drained soil, and then species that were able to be in more poorly drained soil. The big takeaway is that windy and dry conditions seem to happen together, suggesting that increased wind intensity, increased evapotranspiration. Most times the westerlies are thought to be thought of as wet regions as there's increased storm tracks. However, that wasn't true in my site. So I had wind conditions from 3.5 to 5.1 thousand years ago and at 6.2 thousand years ago. I found that there are wet conditions from 2.9 thousand years ago to 3.5 thousand years ago, and then from 5.1 to 5.5 thousand years ago. Taking a look at my overall climate interpretation, I only have time to give the highlights. I found that the last glacial maximum was wrapping up about 16.4 thousand years ago. Notably, the termination for my field site is about 1,000 years later than is typical of the Southern Hemisphere termination. And this is probably due to local factors, such as the marine environment of the Falkland Islands. Taking a look at the late glacial, I've entered cold reversal signal from 13.6 to 14.5 thousand years ago. And during the Northern Hemisphere's youngest Dryas, I have a wet signal. And then just a quick look at the Holocene that we'll see again later. I have a very dynamic Holocene with transitions occurring at 11.2 thousand years ago, 9,000 years ago, and 6,000 years ago. Coming back to my precipitation proxy, previous studies have shown that when the westerlies are at a southern position, it allows enriched precipitation to reach the Falkland Islands in addition to warmer air masses tracking from the northwest. The opposite is true when the westerlies are north of the Falkland Islands. When the westerlies are situated north of the Falklands, it allows depleted precipitation to reach the Falkland Islands. This also allows storms to track in from the southwest, bringing cooler air masses over this region. So with this data, we're going to bring back my precipitation proxy. Once again, all data points that are above this black line now situated over the Falkland Islands shows intervals when the precipitation was depleted, indicating the westerlies were north of their modern position. All areas below are enriched, showing a southern position of the westerlies. So just a quick look at this as we're wrapping up. The last glacial maximum seems to occur during a period where the westerlies were north of their area now, allowing colder air masses to occupy the Falklands. During the termination, there was a southern migration of the westerlies, allowing warmer air masses in. And expectedly during the Antarctic cold reversal, there is a reversal in this trend and position. The younger Dryas has something interesting going on during it that's going to be part of my future studies. And during the Holocene, there is a notable transition at 9,000 and 6,000 years, including an overall cooling in the South Atlantic and a northern migration of the westerlies since the mid-Holocene. And with that, I'm just going to give all my thank yous on this slide. Thank you to everyone who helped me extract all my cores in the field and all the funding that made this possible, especially the Dan and Betty Churchill Exploration Fund. And I will end on the thank you slide.
Thank you so much, Megan. Are there any questions? Dan.
Yeah, so this may be an off-the-wall question and perhaps not a fair one to ask you, but looking at your record, would you pull out times in the Holocene when conditions, both wind conditions for travel to the east and or environmental conditions in the Falklands would have been more or less propitious for human presence? And have you talked with Kit Hamley about this at all?
Yeah, I've looked at Kit's research with this. I believe her record is Holocene entirely, it might be just short of it. But I haven't done much of what my record looks like for the entire Falkland Islands. I think a lot of my record is very dependent to the cirques in Mount Osborne, which is not very hospitable to people, especially if they were coastal communities. I've found that some of the climate of the Falklands is intensified around the Mount Osborne. So I haven't worked out exactly how well my record can be compared to the coastal record. Like for instance, the increased evapotranspiration of the wind isn't seen as strongly at the coastal sites, and that's definitely a bias my data has. But for my pollen record, I haven't seen anything that indicated that there would or wouldn't have been peoples around. And overall, my record doesn't have anything that has a peak of when human occupation would have occurred near my site or on the Falklands.
Thank you.
I'm looking around to see if we've got any hands up. Feel free to jump in if you have a question for Meghan. Great. Well, thanks so much, Meghan, and to all three of you for your presentations today. They were super interesting.
Could I just jump, or if we're just about done, just jump in for a minute?
Please.
Those of you who are longtime attenders of the Borns know that I usually, at the end of the second day, wrap things up in my own particular style. I thought I would try to do this each day. So I have just a few quick comments on 3 talks. I appreciate Heather giving us a very high-minded talk about looking at ice and water chemistry around Mount Everest and the potential impact of tourists. Inga showed us cool approaches to solving the cold bias and MODIS measurement of surface temperatures, or as one might say, to recalculating surface temperatures a la MODIS. And Meghan asked core questions about the long-term record of the Westerlies as expressed in the Falklands, and it seems that at least some of the answers are actually blowing in the wind. Thank you. And I believe with that, we finish today's session. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much, Frankie, for moderating the session so efficiently and effectively. And remember, we don't meet next week, but I will see you all. We'll see all of ourselves next in 2 weeks from today on the 19th. See you then. Have a good week.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.